While the world's attention was fixed on missiles flying over the Strait of Hormuz, China executed a maneuver with far more profound implications. It wasn't a display of military might, nor a veiled threat. It came in the form of a legal declaration. On May 2nd, 2026, Beijing released a formal directive carrying a clear message to the United States. American sanctions hold no authority here. This pronouncement was made openly, officially documented, and now carries enforceable consequences. At first glance, it might seem minor, but in reality, it strikes at the very foundation of the global system, which relies entirely on universal adherence to a single set of rules. China just refused. The question now is stark: if international firms and states face conflicting systems, which one will they obey? Consider this. 89% of all foreign exchange transactions worldwide are conducted in US dollars. This is not a trivial figure. It is central to understanding what just unfolded. Before examining China's move, it's crucial to grasp the machinery it challenges. Most people assume sanctions are purely political. They are not. They are infrastructural. Imagine India wants to purchase oil from Iran. On the surface, it seems like a simple trade. One country sells, the other buys. But the reality is far more intricate because payments are made in dollars. And every single US dollar transaction anywhere on Earth passes through a correspondent bank within the United States. Literally everyone. This is not a metaphor. Nearly 90% of global currency trades rely on the US dollar, not out of affection for America, but because the financial infrastructure necessitates it. Clearing networks, correspondent banks, and the chip system manage over $1 trillion daily, all routed through New York. This gives the U.S. Treasury, specifically its Office of Foreign Assets Control, the capacity to observe, block, or seize virtually any transaction globally. Not through guns or armies, but through the architecture of finance. I first realized the weight of this power researching the case of BNP Paribas, a French bank operating in France, which in 2014 was compelled to pay a fine of $8.9 billion. Their offense, processing dollar transactions involving Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. Actions fully legal under French law. Yet because these transactions intersected with the dollar system, momentarily touching New York, the United States asserted jurisdiction. That was when it became clear sanctions are not political theater. They are the highways of money. Each nation has local roads, but cross-border commerce must enter the American interstate. Washington controls the tolls, deciding who passes, who stops, and who is barred. The penalty for noncompliance is not a ticket. It's permanent exclusion from the entire network. Between 55 and 60% of global reserves remain in US dollars. This is not a reflection of loyalty to Washington. It is simply that no alternative network has the reach or reliability. Now, consider 3 additional layers. First, SWIFT, the global messaging system connecting 11,000 banks across 200 countries, claims neutrality. Yet, when the United States targeted Iran in 2012, SWIFT disconnected Iranian banks. The same occurred after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Neutrality has clear limits. Second, maritime insurance. Over 90% of the world's shipping tonnage relies on Western-regulated P&I clubs. Without insurance, a vessel cannot dock at most ports. Through influence over insurers, the U.S. can halt a nation's oil exports without firing a shot. Third, secondary sanctions. These target anyone doing business with the sanctioned nation. A Turkish bank handling payments for an Iranian company risks losing access to the U.S. financial system. Companies face a binary choice: trade with Iran or trade with America. For global corporations, the decision is rarely optional. By May 2026, the SDN list, the master roster of sanctioned entities, exceeded 70,000 entries across 190 countries. To contextualize, the population of a mid-sized U.S. town such as Galesburg, Illinois, could fill this list. But instead of residents, each entry represents a bank, vessel, corporation, or individual blocked from the global financial system at the whim of a single government. The human and economic consequences are profound. Iran, subjected to severe oil embargoes and swift disconnections, saw petroleum exports fall by 80% at peak enforcement. Russia faced frozen central bank assets totaling $300 billion overnight, prompting a pivot toward yuan-based trade. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, was crippled by sanctions, fueling hyperinflation and production collapse. North Korea remains entirely isolated from legal international finance. Crucially, the system functions only if all major players comply. If a sufficiently large actor refuses, the architecture begins to crumble. On April 24, 2026, the U.S. Treasury imposed sanctions on 5 major Chinese oil refineries, known as teapots, primarily located in Shandong province. These facilities process millions of barrels of crude. Their offense, purchasing Iranian oil worth billions. The entities, Honghe Petrochemical, Shandong Jinchang, Hub Xinhai, Shandong Shuanglu Qing, and Shandong Shangxing, were added to the SDN list and their assets frozen. Any organization conducting business with them risks exclusion from the U.S. financial system. Previously, companies would quietly adapt, restructuring, renaming, routing transactions through intermediaries. But this time, China acted differently. On May 2nd, the Ministry of Commerce invoked the anti-foreign sanctions law, issuing a binding blocking order. This was not mere rhetoric or diplomatic protest. It is enforceable law. The directive states, in effect, that American sanctions are not to be acknowledged, enforced, or observed on Chinese soil. This is outright defiance, not evasion. Historically, nations would navigate U.S. sanctions as one avoids a pothole, carefully, discreetly. China, however, declared, "This is not a recognized road." The law goes further. Amendments in 2026 empower Chinese authorities to penalize any entity within China that voluntarily complies with U.S. sanctions. For instance, a European bank freezing accounts of the 5 refineries would be violating Chinese law. Sanctioned companies may sue these banks in Chinese courts, and the government can seize their assets. For multinational corporations, the dilemma is stark. Compliance with U.S. rules breaks Chinese law, and compliance with Chinese law breaches U.S. sanctions. No compromise exists. Picture the compliance officer at HSBC, overseeing branches in both New York and Shanghai. Washington orders a freeze on Hengli Prochemicals accounts. Beijing counters, freeze those accounts, and Hengli will bring a lawsuit in Chinese courts, while the Chinese government may seize your assets on the mainland. Meanwhile, your legal team in London sits in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., scrambling to determine which law to violate, because inevitably one will be broken. This is no thought experiment. It is the harsh reality facing dozens of global banks today. This is not a minor crack. It is a structural fault line in the global financial system. Let's be clear, this is not a story of heroes and villains. It is about competing interests. The United States holds a legitimate stake in preventing nuclear proliferation. This underpins the Iranian oil sanctions. China, on the other hand, has a valid concern for energy security. Its economy relies heavily on crude imports. Neither position is irrational. But when two rational objectives clash within a system built to accommodate only one set of rules, the system fractures. Laws, financial regulations, the SDN list, blocking statutes, these are all overlays. At its core, the issue is physical: oil. By 2025, China had effectively become the last resort buyer of Iranian crude, not out of choice, but by default. When the Trump administration reinstated maximum pressure sanctions in 2018, every other major buyer stepped back. The European Union, India, South Korea, and Japan all calculated that preserving access to the American financial network outweighed the benefit of discounted Iranian barrels. China evaluated the situation differently. Today, Chinese refineries process between 80 and 91% of Iran's total seaborne oil exports, roughly 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels daily, purchased at a substantial discount of $8 to $10 below the Brent benchmark. For Iran, this trade is survival. For Chinese teapot refineries, it represents profit. For Washington, it is an enduring headache, unaffected by adding more names to the SDN list. The logistics are staggering. Hundreds of aging tankers, part of the so-called shadow fleet, operate entirely outside Western regulations. Their crews disable AIS transponders to vanish from trackers, executing ship-to-ship transfers in international waters off Malaysia and the Gulf of Oman, relabeling Iranian crude as Malaysian or Indonesian in origin. These vessels are registered under chains of shell companies in Palau, the Comoros, Barbados, flags of convenience stacked like nesting dolls. This is not a handful of rogue operations. It is a full-scale industrial logistics network transporting over 1 million barrels per day across thousands of miles, invisible to Western monitoring systems. Many of the tankers are far beyond their typical service life, as newer ships require updated insurance, inspections, and paperwork. A VLCC owned by a mailbox company in Libreville, manned by mariners who know precisely when to disable and re-enable transponders, exemplifies this reality. This is the operational face of large-scale sanctions evasion, ongoing for years. In April 2026, tensions escalated sharply. The United States launched Operation Epic Fury, a naval mission aimed at physically interdicting Iranian oil exports. American warships began stopping and inspecting ships in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's reaction was swift and severe, effectively choking the strait, the single most crucial energy choke point on Earth. 20% of global oil consumption passes through this narrow passage, along with 20% of worldwide LNG shipments. By late April, over 40 tankers carrying 69 million barrels of Iranian crude were trapped in the Persian Gulf, unable to depart or deliver. 69 million barrels simply sat idle. Brent crude prices surged, trading between $108 and $115 per barrel during most of the crisis, peaking at $138 at the worst moments. This spike reverberates across the global economy. Fuel costs at the pump, shipping fees across the Pacific, fertilizer prices in Iowa, electronics in Munich, bread in Cairo, all directly affected. This is not abstract. It is the physics of an interconnected economy reliant on oil, now caught between two superpowers unable to agree on rules. The oil crisis became more than a crisis. It became a catalyst. It forced fence-sitting nations to confront a harsh question: what if the system governing global finance could be weaponized against you? Sanctions, Washington has often overlooked, function as advertisements for alternatives. Every time the U.S. freezes reserves, central banks worldwide take note and ask, could this happen to us? Every swift disconnection prompts engineers in Beijing and Moscow to code replacements. Every tanker seizure fuels investment in a shadow fleet. The consequences are measurable. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined to 56.77%, down from over 64% a decade ago. Central banks are diversifying overtly. China, for example, has been steadily reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. In February 2026, Beijing held roughly $693 billion in treasuries, down from a peak of $1.317 trillion in 2013, a nearly 50% reduction. China is not flooding the market with sales. That would be counterproductive. Instead, it quietly allows maturities to expire, executing a calm, strategic shift. Meanwhile, gold gains prominence. In a world where dollar reserves can be frozen by executive order, gold remains sovereign. It cannot be sanctioned or seized. In the first quarter of 2026, central banks acquired a record 244 tons of gold from Poland, Uzbekistan, and China. In January, gold prices reached $5,600 an ounce, a number that would have seemed implausible just 5 years earlier. Even more consequential is the direction countries are moving toward, not away from. Project M Bridge, a cross-border payment platform leveraging central bank digital currencies, now connects China, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. By 2026, transactions on the platform reached 55 billion, with 95% completed in digital yuan. Settlements are instantaneous, bypassing correspondent banks, SWIFT, and American choke points. A Chinese manufacturer paying a Saudi oil producer completes the transaction in seconds on a system Washington cannot observe, intercept, or halt. BRICS Pay, scheduled for launch at the 2026 summit in India, aims to unify domestic payment networks across BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, along with Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. Together, these nations encompass nearly half the world's population and a growing portion of global GDP. The initiative enables trade in national currencies, entirely bypassing the dollar, not as a pilot project, but as foundational infrastructure. For countries like Russia and Iran, these systems are lifelines. For China, they represent a strategic vision, building a financial architecture where Washington's leverage is regional rather than global. History teaches that no dominant system remains unchallenged. Every empire spawns its own opposition. For over a century, the British pound sterling served as the world's reserve currency. Its fall was not triggered by a single conflict or isolated crisis. The decline unfolded because the financial framework it supported became prohibitively costly for too many nations. Countries explored alternatives, not out of animosity toward Britain, but because it aligned with their self-interest. Look at the pound's trajectory between 1914 and 1945. Britain leveraged its financial might to fund 2 world wars, imposing capital controls, freezing overseas deposits, and wielding its influence as a creditor nation. When the dust settled, even the very allies it had underwritten, especially the United States, had constructed parallel financial infrastructure that rendered the pound unnecessary. The pound did not lose its status by vote in a conference room. Its downfall came because the global system had simply outgrown the structure Britain controlled. The same dynamic is at work today. China does not need to dismantle the dollar system. It only needs to establish a credible alternative. And every time the U.S. intensifies sanctions, it accelerates the construction of that alternative. In this sense, sanctions are counterproductive. Not in an immediate, dramatic fashion, but over time, they gradually erode the very foundation they rely upon. There is profound irony here. The United States wields the most formidable financial weapon in history, yet each deployment instructs the rest of the world on how to build shelters against it. This all connects back to everyday life, to the prices consumers pay. On May 3rd, 2026, the average cost of regular gasoline in the United States reached $444 per gallon, roughly 40% higher than a year prior. In California, the price hit $610. Every multinational, shipping company, and bank must now choose which system to operate in or navigate both simultaneously, a costly and sometimes legally impossible task. History offers a clear pattern. Every empire that exerted global financial dominance, from Rome to Britain, lost control not through military defeat, but through the gradual decay of the system sustaining that control. The mechanism is consistent: overuse of the tool. Broad sanctions create coalitions that construct alternatives, weaponize the currency, and you incentivize dollar diversification. Control choke points, and you drive the creation of new routes. This is not to suggest the U.S. is finished. The dollar remains dominant. American capital markets are still the deepest and most liquid worldwide. U.S. military power continues to outmatch any other nation. But something irreversible occurred in May 2026. The world's second largest economy examined the rules and said, "These are your rules, not ours." It did not merely voice dissent. It built legal shields, financial alternatives, and energy partnerships to support that stance. China did not assault the system. It had no need. Instead, it acted more effectively. It observed patiently as the U.S. weaponized the dollar against Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea. 70,000 entities were added to the sanctions list. While Washington wielded the weapon, Beijing constructed a global framework that the weapon could not reach. This is the moment that commands attention. Not the drama of naval maneuvers in the Strait of Hormuz, not the headlines about surging oil prices, but the quiet, deliberate creation of an alternative world order by a nation operating in decades, not election cycles. The old system has not ended entirely, but it has ceased to be universal. When rules no longer apply to all, they cease to function altogether, and the question now is, what will take its place?